Hey, and welcome back to another episode. Everyone's talking about how AI can make decisions faster. But what if the real question isn't what AI can do, but what leaders should never stop doing themselves? Today, we're diving into one of the most important leadership conversations of our time. And we're doing it with Dr. Adrian Wolfberg, an organizational researcher, a leadership consultant, and founder of the Organizational Insight Consulting company with a career spanning the intelligence community, national security, organizational learning, and decision science. Adrian has spent years studying how leaders make decisions in uncertain environments. His new book, Who Leads When AI Thinks? How Leaders Frame Decisions and Exercise Judgment. He takes a different approach to artificial intelligence. Instead of focusing on the technology itself, Adrian explores the leadership challenges behind it, how to think critically, how to frame the problem effectively, and ensure human judgment remains the center of decision-making. If you've ever wondered how leaders can harness AI without surrendering wisdom, accountability, or strategic thinking, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. So, Adrian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, Tim.
I'm glad we're able to make this conversation happen. We all just heard your incredible intro and bio, but if you don't mind, just tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, well, I've been working for many decades with very complex and critical kind of questions and problems in the national security arena, primarily. I was an intelligence officer for more than 30 years, both as a U.S. naval officer and as a civilian intelligence officer here in the D.C. area, in D.C. And that involved dealing with a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity that forced me to come up with some kind of conclusion that then will be communicated to someone who makes the decision, who has the wherewithal, the tools, the resources to take action. So I have been in the knowledge production role, so to speak, creating knowledge for someone to then take action or not take action, just for someone to listen. So I've been doing that for a long time, and I've been interested for a long time in how that process actually works. So I was involved in doing it for 35, 40 years. But after a certain point, I wanted to understand what was actually going on from kind of a objective or scholarly perspective. And that led me to enter a PhD program, which I completed, focused on how knowledge is created, how it's communicated, and how it's received by someone who's intent to do something with, or whether they do something with it or not, it's up to them. So that's what I've mostly been involved with. I've been involved with kind of as a change agent in some aspects in organization, been involved with intersection of climate change and national security. And I've written two books. One is the one I think we're here to talk about, or the way that us connected on, who leads when AI thinks. And that's kind of in a nutshell how I got here.
I really loved your background and your history, and we have kind of a similar military background connection. So I really love that. So we're going to be able to have this conversation in a little bit different light and help people understand some things a little bit better. So what have you found in the corporate world about how to talk to decision makers versus how to talk to decision makers who were, let's say, more senior, like general officers in the military? Are they similar or are they very different?
I think it's contextually dependent. I think it can be very similar, and the similarity depends on the decision space of the person making the decision. Are they operating with time constraints? Do they have political pressures imposed on them? The whole idea of pressure in its various forms makes it, very similar. It also, I think it's mostly the same. The big differences are not really between the two sectors, but it's really between where in the hierarchy the decision maker is located. So if you're speaking with someone who's at the top of the mountain, well, everybody has someone above them that they're, have to talk with. But, relatively speaking, like someone who's the head of an organization, that's a lot different, a lot easier than someone who is 2 or 3 levels below them.
Yep, absolutely. So when you talk about that, let's talk about how we design and structure the information and package it up in a way that they can receive it. Because I'm thinking about two different groups of folks who listen. We have the folks that are just now entering into leadership roles, and they're going to be, put into positions where like, hey, you got to make a recommendation to a senior leader. How do I do that? Let's talk about that first. What recommendations would you have or advice would you give to somebody in that perspective?
Yeah, there's 2 things that are really critical, at least 2. So let me just start off with 2. One is understanding where that person is at, where they're at in their decision space, what information they likely need or they have questions about. So it's kind of understanding their requirements, and not only from an informational perspective, but also, from their ability to understand things. And that leads me to the second thing is whatever comes out of your mouth or in writing, how well is that person able to absorb, to understand, and to process that information and to apply it in their decision space that they need. So these 2 things are understanding the other person's perspective on how they view the world, both in general and specifically in the timing of the particular issue that you're dealing with, and how well they can absorb new information that's coming from you that you are constructing and transmitting to help them. But you need to understand to what degree they can it's not as much listen, it's listen and then understand so that they can actually decide how and whether they'll use it and to whom they may use it. So it's and kind of the ability to understand the other person's perspective and the ability to understand how well they can absorb information. So those are the 2 main things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I've encountered bosses along the way where I'd have to give them, 4 or 5 days of a read ahead before we have a conversation and even ask them to make a decision. And then I've also had leaders who are like, hey, give me a 5x8 card. You've got 45 seconds and then I'll make a decision. So very true in both instances of time and space and proximity to making a decision and the urgency and the pressures that you had talked about. Now, if I am a senior person organization, and let's say I'm struggling with making decisions. Let's say I'm struggling with the way that information is being presented to me in a way that I'm not able to receive it. What advice would you give that person to say, hey, here's how you could get people to give you the information in which you can receive it?
Yeah. So, that's a really good question. On the flip side, the error on the person who's transmitting is this belief on their part that whatever they understand, you understand. And
Yep.
So from the decision maker's perspective, that's what's happening. They're on the receiving end of something that they don't understand. And so it's really incumbent. It's not because they're stupid or anything like that. It's because this might be technical information that they be unfamiliar with or just new information that they just have never thought about. Whatever. They're certainly smart enough to understand it once it's received in the right way. So in that situation, I tell you what should not be done, and then I'll tell you what should be done.
Okay.
For that person, they should not just give the impression that, okay, I understand it. In other words, just kind of speed things along or so that the person gets out of the way. That should not be done because if you truly don't understand something and you pretend you are understanding it for whatever reason, there could be personal reasons like I don't want to give the impression that I'm stupid kind of because I'm such a smart guy. I'm not making a value judgment here. I'm just saying what the psychology is telling us. Or maybe I don't have enough time to process or listen to what you're saying. Or maybe I don't, for whatever reason, think it's relevant. So all those reasons are not valid reasons for kind of skipping over asking the person who's delivering the information, please provide it in more plain English, pretend I'm your grandmother so that I can understand what you're saying. tell me what assumptions you're making, tell me how you did it. So it's using inquiry to tell the person who's providing the information to express it in a way, to tell the story in a way that I can understand.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I've seen that actual technique happen over and over and over again. Actually, I was thinking about one meeting where there was a certain senior official, and he was like, hey, maybe I didn't ask the question in the right way. I'm going to ask it in a different way, kind of help gear and guide and train that person like, hey, this is how I need the information presented. And there's this interesting phenomenon that's happened over, I would say, last 10 to 15 years, probably a little bit less, where we introduced smartphones and we've become over dependent on the device on where to access information. And we're now in the age of AI where a lot of people solely rely on it to get information. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen through your research on cognitive decline from the smartphone all the way up into the AI age?
Yeah, that's really a good segue. We've seen smartphone usage now for over 20 years, and there's been a lot of research done on it. And and of course, we just know from the public discourse, there's been discussions in public education. There's been policy changes that have been made recently about cell phone usage in the classroom. So those kind of policy decisions have come from decades of research on overdependence on AI. And it's kind of interesting. I'm just thinking of the word overdependence. Well, at the beginning, there was no overdependence. At the beginning, the fear by the cell phone manufacturers was that this would be too complex and too complicated for people to use. And at the beginning, I'm sure that was the case. But over time, it wasn't like people made a conscious decision to become overly dependent upon it. It just became ubiquitous in terms of people's life. And so what the research has shown with I'm going to say with smartphone usage, because now I think for the most part, everybody, maybe not everybody, but we are all overly reliant and overly dependent on smartphones. So certainly with younger generations who are brought up. I mean, I've seen babies in baby strollers, maybe 1 or 2 years old, with a cell phone playing games in their hand. I mean, and that's just the beginning. Yeah. So
yep.
The things that come up are things like the inability to concentrate and pay attention and focus on something for a long period of time. And I'm not talking about days. I'm talking about, tens of minutes or a half an hour or an hour kind of a thing. Anxiety from mostly from social media, the anxiety of not having a continuous pings of input from people in your network, from friends about what's happening or responding to something that you put on in a social media application. So that's there as well. Gosh, those are the main things. There's some other things as well, but the attention and the lack of attention and the anxiety are certainly two of the critical things. The other main thing is the default way of gathering information is by doing a search on Google or doing whatever's available on your smartphone, whether it's large language models or not, instead of, spending the time to think through aspects of the problem, maybe what's really bothering you, what you really need to think about, maybe reading something to help educate you on some kind of perspective. So it's this reduction then of critical thinking. And then the complement of that is a reduction in these are general, of course. It's not
absolutely.
Reduction in creative thinking, because the answers that are provided by this very quick Google search or large language model search, whatever you're using on your smartphone, is virtually instantaneous and is really conducive to, and it's displayed or presented in a way of such that appears to have such high confidence and such clarity that it is so easy to kind of slip into, okay, there's the answer. I don't have to think about it anymore. If I have to move on, I'll just ask another question and so forth. So it's affecting creativity as well in the same way of not being faced with a contradiction or a paradox that the technology appears to kind of eliminate with some quick answers. And if you're not dealing with a paradox or contradiction or some kind of conflict, that's not going to trigger the mechanisms inside of you to think creatively. Well, that's what we know about just smartphones. And over the last few years, there's only been research in the last few years on large language models from people who are using it. And it's mostly been in university students and young adults in the workforce. It's expanding, but there's just a couple of years of this because it's really only come into large scale fruition, really the end of 22, the beginning of 23.
Yeah.
And it's showing that over-reliance or over-dependence is coming up with the same faults or the same issues. And so that's what we know. We can certainly speculate what is going to happen in 5 or 10 years, likely from our experience with smartphone usage.
Yeah, my concern is that, when I grew up in the military and you grew up in the military, we had paper manuals and regulations. And in businesses, we had paper policies and procedures. And part of onboarding any organization would be read the policies and read the regulations, and you would read them. And it takes some time to use your eyeballs and think and read through the paragraphs and go, okay, this is what it is. And you digest it. Like you actually learn something by reading it. And then even over, when we come into the digital age and we're like, going into Google and asking Google for an answer and it spits it out to us. So we're like, okay, well, this is it, right? Even Wikipedia at one point proved that you can't really trust everything on that either because people put reality, right? The reality is opinion. And so people were putting opinions in there instead of facts. And people take that and they run with it as fact. And AI is starting to do the same thing. So how can we fight against this? Because I think the frustration for some of the senior folks out there is like, I know what you're telling me is not true, but I can't put my finger on it. But how do we get to be better critical thinkers about what we're fed? Your background as an analyst is you don't trust anything, I would assume, and you have to disprove everything and to prove it true at some point in time. So how do we get back to that true critical thinking in the workforce?
Yeah, well, let me just take a little piece of that. That's a big question. One of the other things that smartphone usage has done, and we see this in educators who have discussed this at the college level in particular, is we're not providing, it's not happening that reading is a habit anymore. In particular, educators in universities are saying that students are coming in, they never read a book or they can't construct a sentence. But so I just want to focus on reading and how that's important. I don't want to talk about the mechanics of how one could, from a pedagogical perspective, get back into a curriculum. That's not kind of my wheelhouse. But I can tell you that what we know about reading, whether it's reading a policy, what you just said is exactly what the benefit of reading is. It forces you to think about things from different perspectives and things that are more interesting besides policies to read, like, say, a nonfiction book or a fiction book, for example, a novel, a science fi, whatever a fiction book is. Reading creates a opportunity for the mind to wander. And just like even reading a policy, your mind has to wander and look at things from different perspectives, consider how it applies to you in your context. So these are the elements of critical thinking: asking questions, considering other perspectives, asking why, asking where and how. Reading is one very good way that we know this has worked. Other than that, it's having people who are in leadership positions model that behavior.
Yes.
And that in the military this is very, very effective. In fact, military leaders, we know, can benefit their subordinates by modeling their behavior. And if they model it in a bad way, we have lots of case studies that show what happens when that happens. Of course, we don't want that to happen. We want good modeling behavior to happen. So those are kind of two ways. These are one, the first could be part of an educational curriculum. The second is something that would be more, well, it could be also part of a teacher training program, but certainly in the workforce, or regardless of what sector you're in, that this would be important. And so this kind of gets to what is leadership like in today's age. I mean, we're going to talk about it eventually as well. But anyway, I'll back to you.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I will take the shameless ability to make a plug. If you go to timstatontheoffice.com and click on my professional reading list, if you don't know where to start with reading, that's a great place to start. I have a list of books of folks that I have personally talked to and read those books and recommend. So go there if you don't know where to start. But I want to take a detour because you started working with professional sports organizations, if I am correct in remembering. And I was wondering, how did you take what you've learned with your history and your background and apply that to sports decision makers? Because both have high risk and high reward in both arenas. So how did that work for you? And if you don't mind telling me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it was interesting how that got started. My sports colleague read a study that I did, and it was on how general officers, 3- and 4-star commanding generals in military formations, who led troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was my sample population. So these were, as you can imagine, real heavy hitters. These, had people under their control where they were in life and death situations. They were in wartime. So I did a study about how they processed information that came to them. And I did about, 25 interviews with these 3- and 4-stars, almost all Army and a couple of Marine. And so he read that. I don't know how he got to read it, but so he then contacted me and he said, I'm kind of living in a similar situation. I'm living in a situation where it's not a wartime situation, but it's kind of a similar situation where these people have to make decisions about the team members who they're supervising at the moment, as things are going on with high stakes results, where in this business, it's like over $1 trillion business, globally, multi-trillion-dollar business. So that's how it got started. And I didn't really know what to expect because I had never worked with sports leaders. But from everything that I'd been doing for the previous 15 years, I had a feeling that based on studies that I had done on law enforcement, military, and civilians in the national security and public safety arena, that decision-making was kind of going to be probably pretty similar. And so that got me excited about being involved in this study. And it's really about psychology and sociology. And, each kind of sector or each kind of profession, is going to be somewhat contextually dependent upon very specific considerations. 3- and 4-star generals don't make decision in front of television cameras and in a stadium. That's kind of an obvious example. So there's going to be some variation, but I didn't find there was really that much. And a big part of the similarity is the extent that preparation is important for people who are in leadership positions. Now, someone who's like a 22-year-old and they haven't been in a leadership position, that would be a different kind of decision-making process that they would be in. But if you're in a decision-making situation where it's high stakes, big impact, preparation is extremely important. That's across the board. The other thing that I found across the board was the ability to make sense of the situation. We call that sense making, terms that people might be for situational awareness. That's a military term as well. But those terms are used in business as well. So those are the same. Another thing that's common is understanding who has what kind of information and how they can contribute to you in your moment of need. So that is any kind of critical situation where you don't have time to absorb the slack.
Can you give like an example or a story of what that looks like? Because it's important, and I want people to really understand, what does that really mean? Where they come to a, like, who could you leverage in a time of need in that critical space right there?
Yeah. So, for example, in this study of sports coaches, these are sports coaches not in little leagues for 10-year-olds. These are sports coaches who are the head of NFL professional teams or NBA. That's what we're talking about.
Yep.
They know every person on their staff. They know the players. They know their capabilities. They know what they know. They know how they ingest the information they know. They have somewhat of an idea of what's going to come out of their mouths in terms of the quality and integrity of the information. And then they may even have made recommendations to them in the past that they would like this or they would like that or whatever. But as you know, humans just don't turn on a dime. They're still going to behave certain ways, and it takes time. So, a coach, I don't know if I have a specific example, but for a particular problem, like should this player be pulled now and undergo some additional training before we put him back in? Or is this injury so severe that we have to yank him? Or should we hire this person or not? Should we take this player out right now in the middle of the game because they look whatever, XYZ. So they do not have 100% situational awareness about every single thing that's going on. They're like anybody else. We all have a span of attention that's focused on certain things. So, maybe they're getting a glimpse of what's going on, but there probably also would benefit from other perspectives about people who not only can physically see things from different angles, but can also interpret things from other angles. So here we're talking about medical staff, assistant coaches, performance scientists, physical therapists, the sports psychologists. Mm-hmm. So there's a bunch of people who have different perspectives who are having eyes on what's going on that person would benefit from. And the optimal situation is if those individuals who have perspectives, who can see that the leader would benefit without being asked, those are kind of the best kind of information sources to come forward. Secondary at sports psychologist, ABC, come and tell me what you think about this situation.
Those are all really, high stakes in the moment decisions you have to make. And I could only imagine the thought process and decision making that goes along with it, and being able to leverage those key assets to be able to help you determine that. And you mentioned earlier that, if somebody is entering the workplace, they may not be in these types of situations, but the best way to prepare is to read. Like we've talked about, anytime I've deployed somewhere, I've always read tons of books, and actually read books about the area from the people that I was going into to get their perspective of it. And you have had a career of 40 plus years of analyzing and getting information and researching and developing stuff. And you recently wrote a book. So if you don't mind, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I wrote a book that came out this year. It's called Who Leads When AI Thinks? And it came from a history of about 10 years of thinking about this. But just for time's sake, I'm just going to go right to the book. And I'm not a technical guy. I mean, I've done technical things. I've worked with computers. I've programmed computers. But I'm coming at this problem from the leader's perspective who is not an engineer and who does not have the technical or the bandwidth to become an expert in the technology. And so I'm looking at the perspective of what's the strategy? What's the high level strategy that I, as the head of the organization, or I, as the head of some director level part of the organization, what is the strategy that should be used? And here I'm talking about how to think about the match or the combination of what the human contribution is and the machine contribution is. And in the book, I have a kind of a framework for how to figure that out. And then in that strategy, so that's kind of like the blueprint of architectural drawings for a building. And then I talk about what actually is going to happen in the situation, kind of like you go to a construction site, you are watching the people there building the building based on the blueprint that the architects did. So it's then helping you understand how the flow of information crossing between machines and humans is occurring. That's the second part of the strategy. And the third part, I think, is one of the most important, and that is this assertion that I'm making. I don't think it's controversial, that the world is changing. And not only is the world changing, but really everything in the world is changing. And especially, so, in the military, what we say is, I can't remember the exact phrase, but, when we have a plan or a strategy, its life is as good as until it's contact with the enemy.
Yep.
And then it falls apart. Why? Because the other player has a voice in what's going on. Well, the same is true in business and any sector. So recognizing that the problem itself and the solution space itself is changing. Now, that's more important to understand in the life of the evolution of AI, where things are changing so fast in that arena. So that's kind of the high level strategy. And none of that requires any technical knowledge. You have to be working with a team and have team members who have that technical knowledge. But you're doing this from a leadership perspective. What's critical in the nuts and bolts of this framework is to understand the nature of the problem that you're actually attacking. Now, this is not unique to working with AI. It's just accentuated when working with AI. Because if you don't understand what the problem is, then AI, the machine, will interpret what it thinks the problem is. And once that's done, once that framing is done, the problem will move along in its path. And if you like the overuse and overdependence on cell phones and AI, you will lose control of what's going on. So understanding the nature of the problem is really key. And the book talks about ways to do that, looking at different simple frameworks, and then understanding not only the components of the problem. So when we say something like solve world hunger, well, if you try to attack it just with that sentence, you're not going to get anywhere. So you have to decompose the problem into subsets. And as you decompose problems, each decomposition has its own unique combination of AI and human contribution. So that's, in a nutshell, what's part of the strategy. And then the rest of the book is primarily, what are the competencies as a leader and as people who are working with you? What are the competencies that they need to pull this off? And so that's learning, the ability to learn, the ability to understand, and the ability to be able to see across boundaries, be like a boundary spanner, and understand different people's perspective. So those are the competencies. And to me, this idea of leadership strategy in the age of AI is going to be totally different than how we've imagined leadership in the past. So there's going to have to be a developmental effort, a training effort, whatever, because for the first time in history, we have a machine companion in the decision-making process. That has never occurred before. And so when we just have had humans, we kind of understand humans as best that we can understand. Of course, there are limitations to that, but we are far, far behind understanding machines and so forth. So that's why having a high-level strategy and having a leadership strategy at the high level is important, and what this book is about, and is intended to help kind of navigate from the beginning, so that at the end, you don't come back and say, oh, geez, we just wasted X amount of dollars and X amount of time.
And I have seen this happen countless times recently with AI, people solving the wrong problem, and then people lacking the essential skills. I know you listed off a few, but some of the skills that came to mind was being critical thinkers. Are you asking the right questions? Are you receiving what's coming out of it? And strategy. Most people don't even know where to start with the strategy when it comes to AI. They just think, well, my strategy is buy stuff, and we've seen that with, I will say, with the systems of systems approach. We have a system or a device that has a program application to solve a certain problem, and then another department department has another system with a device to solve a different problem. And next thing you know, we went from one problem to 32 problems because we bought more stuff. And what I would hate to see in the future is we just buy more AI stuff to then solve more problems that we self-created. And I really love the strategy that you've put out there because one, reading is fundamental. So folks, definitely go into the show notes of this episode, get his information out there. He has a great strategy for you to implement at a high level to even start thinking about what type of strategy do I want to implement it as a company. So Adrian, my last question to you is there anything that we didn't talk about that you were like, you know what, I really would wish you would ask this one question or this one thing?
Yeah. I think one challenge that we all face today is, and what this strategy really entails is to take time that we've been reluctant to take time. And we can see this in examples that you've talked about, in examples I've seen in senior sports executive perspectives. We can see it in business applications. Simply put, it's the other guy has this, get me some of that. And that just skips all the things that the strategy that I just talked about. And so what I would want to impart is that, yes, there is going to be some upfront time that's going to have to be sequestered to handle some of this front end thinking, but you're going to get the advantage of that on the middle and the back end. Yes, if you skip it and you go to the get me some of that stuff because the competitor has it, you will get it. You will quickly get to a very quick start, but you will very quickly get into a, failed or disappointing situation. So this is going to be something new for people, that they have to manage time in a way that has been unfamiliar to them in the past. And some people do this very well. We hear some very interesting stories about some executives that are, leading some very, kind of popular, well-known organizations, and what they do every day as part of their practice. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, is to take the time, whatever problem that is being faced, to make sure that the problem is truly understood. And that's an art to do that. It's not just hey, staff, tell me what the problem is. You really have to think about that. And I hope people get my book and will open their mind to how they can do that. And it's not in a technical way at all, but it's something that then can be applied to people who are doing things with AI.
And there's tons of technical stuff out there, and we need more plain English stuff for human beings to talk to other human beings. So I really appreciate everything that you shared, Adrian. So for everyone watching this and listening to this, go to the show notes. You're going to be able to find everything that he has to offer, all the links and everything to get a hold of him and his book. And I appreciate you stopping by. And Adrian, thank you for stopping by and having a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's been a pleasure, and I'm very glad that you invited me, and this has been a great time talking with you.